Can you hear me? Ooh, that's good and loud. Good afternoon, everyone. We've all been conferencing for quite some time now these past couple of days with early mornings and late evenings, so starting to flag a little bit. So I'll ask you one more time. I'd love to hear a call and response. Good afternoon. Excellent. We're all here. I'm Andrew Solinger. I am the CEO and publisher of Foreign Policy Magazine. Welcome to our beautiful rooftop annex, just a few short walks from the Beerscherhof. I think you might know a little bit about FP, but for those who are the uninitiated, we are the premier magazine and media organization focused on geopolitics. We're based in Washington, D.C., but we operate around the world, and we love MSC. This is a fantastic opportunity for us to meet you, to focus on programming that matters to us, and we're so happy that you're joining us here. Today, we are undertaking a couple of hours focused on emerging threats. There's a lot of big geopolitical topics talked about today, and what we are focusing on are the ones that might get a little less attention and need some focus. So I hope you're going to stay with us for the next few hours. We have a jam-packed agenda. Just want to run down. By the way, you have cards on your chairs with a QR code where you can link through to the agenda, but just a couple of highlights. We're going to start off talking about NATO and innovation. We're going to talk about the connected car and transport security. We had a roundtable dinner on that very topic last night in this space. We're going to talk about cyber mercenaries, pathogens, a little discussion on a simulation we did earlier this week, the Tehran Security Conference, a anti-sister meeting to the Munich Security Conference. We are going to discuss the importance of soft power and aid that backs up that soft power. Ukraine, we can't have an event at MSC without discussing that. And then we're going to close it out with a discussion of AI with the Prime Minister of North Macedonia. So I hope you'll stay with us for that. I wanted to share a couple of housekeeping tips and tricks. Restrooms are on these pocket doors on the side here, right next to where you are. So feel free to use, but make sure you slide those pocket doors closed when you go in there. I won't get into any more detail than that, but that would be very, very good and polite. We're not going to have Q&A from the audience, I'm afraid, today. We're not going to have time for that, and we don't want to be disruptive to the great jam-packed speaker schedule. So please save your comments. Hopefully, you can talk afterwards. I want to say hi to the folks we're live streaming to in TV land. You also will not be able to ask questions. I'm so sorry. But again, we look forward to hearing from you. And very importantly, I want to thank the partners that enabled this program today. They include General Motors, the Gates Foundation, the Special Competitive Studies Project, CEPI, the Nuclear Threat Initiative, Sentinel Bio, and Microsoft. And speaking of Microsoft, at FP, we have many different divisions and groups. We're not just a magazine and digital site. FP Analytics is our independent research arm. It's kind of like an in-house think tank. And FP Analytics just released its 5th installment in its Digital Frontline Special Report. And that's an ongoing multi-year project that we've undertaken with Microsoft to focus on cyber. And this features contributions from U.S. Cyber Ambassador Nathaniel Fick, the UK Minister Stephen Dowdy, and others, and it focuses on cyber mercenaries, one of our topics today. And then lastly from me, you know what FP is. I won't ask you to raise your hand if you do or don't, but I hope you subscribe to FP. This is about a sample of the kind of content that we produce. You have magazines on your chairs. If you don't subscribe, you should while you're sitting here. We have easy QR codes in there for subscriptions. I will take a test afterwards to see who subscribed. With that, let's get going with our program.
Please welcome Jean-Charles Ellerman-Kingobe, NATO Assistant Secretary General for Innovation, Hybrid, and Cyber, for a conversation on innovation and defense with FP Analytics' Dr. Maisha Alam.
Hi, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here, and thank you so much for joining us for this program. And Assistant Secretary General, thank you so much for joining us as well. Let's dive right in, and I'd love to start by asking you, can you tell us a little bit about what the threat landscape looks like for NATO, both in cyberspace, but also just more generally in the world?
Well, I think to sum it up, it doesn't look good. I'm 54 years old. In my youth, was a time of hope, and I think this is probably some of the worst things I've seen in my lifetime. Obviously, we've got Ukraine. We're in the third year of Russia's attempt to wipe Ukraine off the map. And we're seeing also in NATO, in Europe, that we're also in the receiving end. We are facing intense and even more reckless hybrid attacks also in the cyber field. And then there are China and their ambitions to basically undo the rules of the game in the global space that we know of. So I think on many levels, we are living a very difficult time.
Yeah, and it is quite daunting, just the enormity of the challenges and the very many domains in which those challenges are appearing. And I'd love to pick up on something you talked a little bit about with respect to the hybrid warfare. And so let's talk about NATO's cyber defense and cyber deterrence capabilities. How can emerging and disruptive technologies be adopted into military settings within the alliance, especially considering that, member states have such varying capabilities? How are you approaching this? And what are some strategies that you think will be really important going forward?
First, I think it's important to understand that we're living a tech race. The Chinese are investing massively. They've got a seamless relation between the defense industry and the defense forces. We've got Russia learning from the battlefield in Ukraine, bringing down substantially the time of the development cycles. So there is a tech race, and we cannot take it for granted that we are winning. I think one of the key issues to address is pace. And if you look at emerging technology, data, software, AI, they are transforming the way that war is being fought. We see that in Ukraine. That will impact us all. How do we adopt these technologies? The interesting thing is that many of the solutions, they are already on the shelves in sectors outside of defense. Those new entrants to the defense area come with another approach to development cycles, and we need to adapt to that. And a few things here. First, I think there's an issue of risk. There was a cultural issue. If we don't embrace risk, if we don't provide the incentive structures to fail again, test again, fail before you succeed, then we will not get where we want to. Two, we also need to ring fence funding for innovation, and then I think to facilitate this more iterative development cycles, we need to facilitate more demonstration and testing. We need to have a hard look at our procurement cycles. We need to go from unnecessary specific requirements to a greater focus on the sought-after effects. We need to build a bridge between an incoming community that has all the solutions but doesn't know in detail the requirement, and a defense that knows its requirements but doesn't know all the goodies that are there on the shelves. And then finally, I think we're talking about transformative technologies. I myself come from a non-tech background. I don't understand the potential of AI, but neither does many of the decision makers in our acquisition branches, in top levels in defense or ministers of foreign affairs. And so we need also to have an effort, a concerted effort of education of the top branch in security for them to understand. If they don't understand, they will not embrace, they will not invest.
That's, I think, you raised some really important points, and it goes back to what you were talking about in terms of the enormity of the challenges and the threat landscape. And one of the things that NATO has been increasingly focused on and forward-leaning on is protecting critical infrastructure, whether that is from coordinated cyber attacks or sabotage or otherwise, including, for example, more recently, the subsea cable initiative. Tell us a little bit about that and how you're going about trying to not only protect critical infrastructure, but to do so within the kinetic and cyber domain.
I think, first of all, it's important to take a step back and remind that attacks on our critical infrastructure are part of a wider hybrid package. I don't like the word hybrid because what does it mean? Hybrid is a part of a deliberate policy, an integrated part of the Russian military doctrine to destabilize our societies. This is the first thing they do to provide themselves options before they take potential further steps. So we need to understand that motive and going after our infrastructure, our critical infrastructure, is a very deliberate strategy. We see what they're doing in Ukraine. We see the potential on our own soil. So I think here we need to be very, very careful. We have seen for some time that the critical infrastructures in the Baltic Sea have been under pressure, and therefore we have increased our presence, NATO, to reduce the window of those that want to do malign activities and to increase the surveillance. We are also introducing new technology to improve our ISR, and I think a general feature in that work, particularly in strengthening our situational awareness, is to also tap in knowledge, the piles of data that the private sector is sitting on. The private sector actually owns much of the critical infrastructure, so we need to build a much stronger cooperation with the private sector, also in the protection of the critical infrastructure.
That's actually a perfect segue to where I wanted to go next, which is specifically about partnerships. And tell us a little bit about what partnering on innovation looks like with the private sector for NATO. What are some initiatives that you're taking on, and how are you partnering with the private sector to increase innovation?
Well, first of all, we've taken we've launched a number of new initiatives in recent years. The so-called Diana program, which is a facility that identifies startups, help them accelerate. We have launched the NATO Innovation Fund, also an important initiative. I think both these initiatives are starting to show results. There is a good engagement with an ecosystem that didn't know defense well previously. But I think most importantly, we need to integrate innovation at the heart of the way that we organize ourselves. Capability requirements, development and capability requirements are at the heart of how NATO works. You've got the overall military plans, and you identify what is the gear that we need to match those plans. We have, in the past, announced or communicated a number of requirements to allies and told them this is how it should look. Now we're telling them we need you to do this, we need you to have, for instance, a brigade, and we would think that a brigade would look like this. But if you can put that brigade together in another way, fewer tanks, more UAVs, then go ahead. So we are building in an innovative drive for allies to engage with private sector in fielding in new assets more quickly and potentially also at a lower cost.
That's great, and I love the examples of both Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund. One of the things that's been a recurring theme of conversation throughout Munich Security Conference this week is in this, technology and particularly AI age and the race that's ongoing. How do we balance ethical considerations with that technological race? How are you all thinking about that within NATO?
I mean, as we develop new policies on new technologies, we have the habit of addressing specifically the responsible use. So I think there is this ethical lens. But I think we also need to be straight. There is an issue of pace. Now, we as an alliance, which is also building on values, are putting some obstacles on ourselves because we need to abide by rule of law, respect certain number of criteria, and we must do so. But we need also pace. And our adversaries, they don't have any guardrails. They're just plowing ahead. And I think on AI, data, software, I think it's important that we go do, and that we don't waste, lose the race the tech race that we are currently facing. So there are some dilemmas. We have the responsible use in our policies. Now we need also to go out and pursue the opportunities and go to so that our adversaries do not win that critical race.
Well, I know that question of balance and that challenge is going to come up over the course of multiple conversations today. But let me take this opportunity to thank you for joining us and for sharing your insights and all that you're doing at NATO in your role. Thank you so much, Assistant Secretary General.
Next, please welcome Dr. Janka Erdl, the Director of the Asia Program at the European Council on Foreign Relations, Dr. Benedetta Berti, Director of Policy Planning in the Office of the Secretary General at NATO, and Jonathan Black, the Deputy National Security Advisor and Prime Minister's G7 and G20 Sherpa in the UK Cabinet Office, along with Foreign Policy's Alison Carlson, for a panel discussion on securing connected vehicles and transport infrastructure.
It was an excellent discussion to kick us off, and in case you weren't awake, you are now. Thank you everyone for joining us here in the room today and also online. I know everyone has such a packed MSc schedule, so we really appreciate you sharing a little bit of your day with us. And as is described, this forum is about emerging threats. And as we were just hearing, we are rolling out so much innovation. Our societies are digitizing, and development is going very fast and increasingly fast pace. And how are we going to manage the increasing threats with the increasing attack surface of that digital space, especially as it relates to critical infrastructure? And there are often these conversations about critical infrastructure, but one of the underappreciated issues that isn't talked about as much is related to vehicles, and connected vehicles in particular, that increasingly have advanced sensor systems, both for the interior and exterior of their vehicles, and are recording information continually to increase efficiency, performance, but also those are opportunities for surveillance, tracking, and other attacks. And so that is something that is part and parcel and needs to be part of this conversation as well. And so I'd like to kick off, Benedetta, to you first, and then Jonathan, over to you, in where you sit in your respective organizations and government. How are you thinking about connected vehicles and the transportation system in particular and the threat landscape? What should we all be thinking about, and how are you working on this issue right now?
Certainly. And I think that this is I can piggyback on some of the points that the Assistant Secretary General for Hybrid and Innovation and Cyber just made. And I think he phrased it very aptly by saying, first of all, we have to recognize what's the threat environment, what is the strategic environment. And the strategic environment is one where we have adversaries and competitors essentially utilizing non-kinetic tools to destabilize, to undermine our security. So in other words, the weaponization of everything, right? And if you do buy into that lens, and I think unfortunately the reality does back that interpretation, then everything can become a vulnerability. But some issues are more critical than others because they really deeply affect national security. And when you talk about transportation infrastructure, well, at large, for us, when I think about resilience and I think about what are the key sectors that need to be resilient in order for our collective defense to work, in order for militaries to be able to operate seamlessly, well, I think transportation infrastructure, I think digital communications, I think satellites, I think the energy grid and our energy supplies, and I think those are really part and parcel of how we maintain a credible defense position. So that's the broader piece. You need a resilient, redundant, secure transportation infrastructure at large. That's essential for military mobility. So for our troops to be able to deploy, to move, to exercise. So that is the entry point. Then whatever you plug into their energy that transportation infrastructure, if whatever you're plugging in is vulnerable, then you are importing risks. So when you're thinking about connected vehicles, there's a number of issues that you may want to go through. In terms of cybersecurity, surveillance, data gathering, potential risk of espionage, that's of course the first layer. Then you want to look into what is the supply chain. What type of dependencies are related to the supply chain of connected vehicles, and how does that affect, how can that create leverage points that can be then weaponized or utilized against us? That's another one you would want to look at. You would want to look at ownership structure, who owns the technology, how is it transferred. So there's a number of issues. If I had to make a very long story short, which I have to, I would say that the key point is you have to incorporate security by design. So as you make this economic and choices, you need to incorporate national security considerations and assess risks and respond accordingly. So if you have that lens, then you can take risks in a more responsible way. And I think sometimes we don't really have the national security concerns front and center as they should be.
Thank you for that. I think that lays out the landscape quite well, and especially from your position within policy planning in NATO and how you're thinking about that from a defense perspective and preparedness perspective, and really needing to go upstream by design, as you said. Jonathan, from your perspective and with your security lens on, but also recognizing that this is a combination of needing to protect national security, but also foster economic growth and other priorities within the government. How are you thinking about this issue in particular?
Well, thank you, and thanks for inviting me to this panel, and for everyone joining. And really, just to add actually to what you have just said. I mean, I think the range of things that we could talk about, sort of falling into this sort of question of what you just sort of touched on, of our sort of overlapping economic and security interests, is pretty broad. But actually, connected vehicles are probably one of the best examples to touch on, because they bring in almost all of the different policy things that we're thinking about. And maybe just one remark to get going, and then we'll see how the conversation goes. I think one thing that's useful to think about is actually we're quite often thinking about a slightly different set of things when we're thinking about our security and our resilience and what have you. And I try and divide them into three things. One, you have a set of things where there's a very specific and direct set of national security related questions. And that's becoming increasingly complicated in a world where the definition of potential dual use in your technologies is much more blurred than it's ever been before. But that's one thing. And that's obviously relevant to what we're talking about here. There's then another, which is actually a bit more about sort of strategic dependency on single suppliers and single supply chains for things that you might regard as being sort of critical to your economy, or indeed your national resilience, which is not directly about national security. It's a sort of broader question about dependency. And then you've got a third bit, which is more around your own domestic economy and the competitiveness of that, and the opportunities that presents for investment and jobs in your own economy. And the sort of questions that we ask ourselves about electric vehicles, or connected vehicles more specifically, are actually about all three of those things. And the policy making challenge is how you reconcile them and think about them both separately but also coherently.
Exactly, and I'd like to pick up on that tension or the complementarity of the economic piece and the security piece, and turn to you, Janka. I know you've done years of research on this and thinking through the different trade-offs in terms of policy priorities and where electric vehicles and connected vehicles fit into this. And so when you're thinking about this issue, which has not yet risen to the fore to the degree that it has, what are some of those trade-offs? And from your perspective, what needs to be prioritized, and how can they be balanced so that policymakers can really start to think about national security as well as economic growth, understanding that there is an energy transition underway as well?
Thank you very much for the invitation. And since I'm not a government representative, I may be the one that is allowed to be a bit blunt in this conversation and say the word that we all need to say. That is that we are undergoing a revolution in the vehicle space. That means that China is now the largest force in this, and that we don't trust China. And that this is the reason why we have a problem with connected vehicles, because we wouldn't have a problem with connected vehicles if we wouldn't trust China. So that said first, I think is sort of the main argument that you need to see. If you have a major economic player that is going to be part of your economic system and your transportation infrastructure and your telecommunications infrastructure and your infrastructure and your harbors, then you need to ask the question about trust at a certain point. I haven't researched I'm a sinologist by training. You know, this is when the China watchers become the tech experts. So this is how far we have come. But this is what I have done research on is how the Communist Party behaves, how industrial structures are built, and how you are competing in an industrial space with the strategic interests of the Communist Party. And when you are competing with the strategic interests of the Communist Party, then as a single company, you have not much to say. And even as a small country in Europe, and we're all small countries in comparison, there's very little leverage that you have in terms of regulating this space and in terms of not taking a solution on the way it is. So I've come to this topic from the 5G conversation, which is very similar in that sense, but it is also very different in one respect, and that means that in the car and the vehicle industry, we're dealing with a business-to-consumer industry. So that means that people are buying cars. People are not buying 5G antennas. 5G antennas can be regulated later, even if they're in the system at a certain point, you can still get them out. But once a person has bought a car, you can't take it away anymore. So the biggest problem we're facing in this sector right now in terms of regulating the security of electric vehicles coming from China is speed. Coming into the market with an enormous amount of speed, and the adaptation, the growth rates are very, very high. At the same time, production of our vehicles and of our vehicle producers is moving to China, which further enhances the problem. And we're having a development cycle that is now meaning that models are churned out at such a high rate that it will be really hard to regulate exactly what's coming into our markets. And so all that said means the European Union introduced electric vehicle tariffs also to buy some time for actually figuring out what we're doing on the security side of this and whether we can find a collective solution. The US has made a call on this. Basically excluded Chinese connected vehicles from their market as a kind of total ban solution. That might be the only version of doing it in a situation of zero trust. But the European Union, I think, is still trying to figure out whether through an intelligent risk assessment, whether through quotas or through processes that enhance competition, there is a possibility of having some participation of Chinese vehicles in the market because we want fast decarbonization and electrification of our transportation infrastructure, and that's the only way we're going to get it. So it's a super complicated set of things, but raising awareness to the fact that consumer choices here will later on shape national security perspectives, and that we better regulate before the fact and not after, because in Chinese vehicles, it's not security or privacy by design, it's surveillance by default. And I think we have to be very, very mindful of that.
When you think about those concepts of surveillance by default and trying to strengthen critical infrastructure, what are the policy tools that can be used to mitigate those risks for cyber vulnerabilities and surveillance, understanding that cars from China and elsewhere in the world are already coming into the market? And so what can be done now from a policy perspective, but also an awareness-raising perspective? Jonathan?
Well, I mean, our sort of position, UK government's position on connected vehicles is a sort of very live sort of policy conversation. So maybe it's a bit easier just to sort of step back a little bit and look at what the range of tools you've got are, and that's partly why I made that distinction between those three areas. And there's something also on timing there as well, in terms of what options you might have now versus things that you have down the road, including in having diversity of suppliers and all of those sorts of things, which in some of these areas, leaving aside specific countries, I mean, there are single suppliers all the way through these things, and we saw the same thing with 5G as well. The question, of course, when it comes to the more specific sort of technological end of it, becomes, as you then do try and become quite technical about the extent to which your technical authorities can see ways of managing and mitigating risks that you might think, which which might be there. And actually, you're right, the comparison with 5G is different, but the similarity is about people's data and their personal data. So it's something as government officials we sort of take very seriously, because it's actually the sort of core of one of our responsibilities for people. So that's the sort of area, and you want to sort of look in that space. Obviously, at the further end, you then get into the space like we did in the end, of course, with some of the 5G related things. Do you decide what you do and don't, you are and aren't willing to have in your own market?
I'd love to dig into this data piece a bit more. Certainly there are issues pertaining to privacy, consumer privacy, but also data storage, data sharing, data transfer. And so when you all are thinking about that, and Benedetta, I'd like to turn to you, when you think about data sharing and sharing with allies, how are you thinking about that as it relates to protecting critical infrastructure broadly, but specifically this issue?
Well, there's a few pieces to that, to this question, which is, I think, very, very important. Partly, the first question you ask is how we do it within the alliance, and that's slightly different. But we have, as 32 allied countries within our militaries, a data exploitation framework that essentially sets some guardrails, some guidelines on how we store data securely, how we share data securely, how we utilize data to improve our situational awareness picture, our ISR, joint ISR. So we do have a framework in place for data sharing, because we understand that when it comes to highlighting strategic resources, data is probably one of the most important ones. So we do have a way we do this within the alliance. More broadly, however, I think the question of connected vehicles, and going back also to what Janka was saying, it goes back to the question of how do you balance between economic choices and national security choices. And I would say, of course, the balance is struck differently in different capitals, but from where we sit in Brussels, from where we sit in NATO, our role is to essentially lay out what the security risks and vulnerabilities are, which are factual. Then, of course, each government can take decisions. As a sovereign government, they decide how to strike that balance, but our job is to provide an assessment and to explain these are the risks you may be importing if you take this choice, and these are some of the mitigations you can implement. And that's why, in a way, this 5G conversation is germane, because we had this very similar discussion in NATO a few years ago, where, of course, individual allies pursue their national security policies as they wish, but we are providing a threat level and saying, well, given that our militaries need to be interoperable, need to communicate with each other, need to rely on a secure 5G networks, this is what we need. These are the requirements. And if these requirements are not met, these are the risks, these are the vulnerabilities. Then ultimately it's a policy choice, how to trade off and square the circle between different strategic imperatives. But from a security perspective, I think we provide that risk piece, that risk assessment to inform decisions. And I think that's extremely important, because we are learning that the vulnerabilities and dependency can and are being weaponized, and we don't have to go very far away. If you think after Russia started its full-scale invasion against Ukraine in 2022, as Europeans, we learned the hard way what it's like to have a one-sided dependency on Russian oil and gas. And of course, that's a lesson that we are trying to very much internalize, going back to Janka's points in terms of thinking at dependencies on the PRC, for example, and what does that mean for national security. So it's a good lens through which we look at this broader issue of strategic dependency on competitors and adversaries.
And it does mean that national security and economic security do go hand in hand. So let me just simplify this and break this down. If we don't regulate the influx of Chinese vehicles into the European market, then in the long run, there is no business case for producing cars in Europe. There is no business case for European cars, quite frankly, because Chinese cars will beat us on price point wherever. So that means that then your alternatives are gone as well. And we've seen the same in other industries as well, the solar industry, the telecoms industry, the wind industry, the rail rolling stock industry. This is not a one-off. So we know that the attempt is to dominate supply chains fully, and that generates security for the Chinese leadership. And so if we know all of that, then that means that there will be massive competition between Chinese brands, but not necessarily with our actors anymore. And that then changes your national security landscape again, because if you don't have an alternative for the technology choice, if you don't kind of retain that technological capacity, then you're pretty screwed on your national security front. And that was one of the arguments in the 5G debate, to say if the market in Europe is not open for these companies, or if they can't compete against the price points of Chinese competitors, then we will in the long run have a security problem, because we won't have Western providers anymore. So I think this is how the security assessment and the technical assessment is one bit of this, but the sort of long-term economic diversity argument is another one.
And so in the context of increasing focus on sovereignty, fragmentation of various sorts, and the need for greater cooperation, interoperability, as you were stating, what are some near-term actions that can be taken to forge those networks, the alliances, the bonds, and greater cooperation on this issue specifically in the context of the world we're living in, with those tensions and that, focus on data localization and other sovereignty-related issues?
Well, maybe I can kick it off with a couple of things that we're doing at NATO in the broader framework of how do you build resilience, which we see very much as a national responsibility, but it's also a collective one to enable our collective defense. And so we have I highlighted before what we consider to be critical to our defense, to our collective defense sector. So energy, infrastructure, civilian space, satellite, digital communication. And for those, we have guidelines that is essentially set guardrails and link our defense planning with resilience objectives. And then our individual allies develop national plans that essentially translate those broader objectives into so what for their critical infrastructure. And that's, I think, very important to, again, there will be differences, national differences, but ultimately seeks greater convergence on how do we protect what we consider to be defense critical infrastructure. And I think that's very important. Other tools that we have is foster more cooperation among allies and partners, protect our key industries, assets, and technologies, think very carefully about what is exported, what critical technologies and assets are exported, and to who and why. These are all conversations that we can and we are having in a NATO context. And then, of course, we also want to look at critical vulnerabilities in terms of foreign direct investments, ownerships. A lot of this discussion for European countries will occur in the EU framework, but the place where they occur is less important. What is important is that they occur and that there is coordination and awareness and also policy responses. There's still a lot of work to be done, but I think we know what essentially the right steps are.
And Jonathan, for you?
Yeah, so, this is an area that's has evolved and is evolving a lot as the sort of global economy just changes. I think three things I would say. One is I think you are seeing all countries, and this is not just about connected vehicles, in a sort of broader sense about our economic security. All countries have been sort of evolving and developing and changing the sort of policy toolkit they've got to give themselves some more choice. In the UK, we've introduced our own new inward investment regime, for example, and export control measures. There's the same with others. So I think you're seeing countries evolve their toolkit. There's then been, and I'm actually handing on my G7 responsibilities, but the G7 has become a very important forum for coordinating and cooperating on the evolution of those sorts of measures amongst a group of like-minded countries. That's been done in a sort of an acute sense, if you like, as we work through our response to in what's happened in Ukraine, but also in some of the more broader senses, both in terms of the extent to which our systems align or not, but also how we just sort of learn from each other as we do these sorts of things. I think the third thing I would sort of touch on, which is the bit that actually is sort of, maybe interesting is the wrong word, but most interesting for sort of policy making, is quite a lot of these questions are not about it, also about government deciding X or Y. It's also about the market making a judgment for itself about managing its own risk, and how the government can facilitate the market doing that sometimes. And that is a reflection of the sort of more complicated boundary of dual use. So how we as government work with the private sector on that is I think, a sort of big area that needs us to give more thought to. In the UK, we've created National Cyber Security Centre, for example. We've got this new Protective Security Authority, which are all about ways of thinking about how we engage with our sort of business sector. That's an area I think that is going to continue to evolve quite a lot as well.
Thank you. I think we are sitting here, as you all know, at the backdrop of MSC, and I think there is a real opportunity here to raise awareness of this issue and have a bit of a call to action. It is an opportunity to really engage both with policymakers, but also the private sector, as I think you really importantly pointed out. And so, Janka, if you had your call to action for this audience and those listening as well as those down the block, what would that be with respect to this issue?
So I think the first one would be it's a question of urgency and time. We really don't have time on this to waste, and this means everyone has to swing into action now. And that means also, and that's very uncomfortable for European policymakers, if you don't have enough time, and when in doubt, ban. We will not have a full understanding of the risk landscape sometimes before we have to act. And that will require political decisions to be brave enough to say, for the time being, we have to shut this out of the market until we understand, until we can have a solution of finding, having a little bit of the product coming in, etc. So I think that's one issue. Then the other issue that I find really important is that the US and Europe need to work together on this, and not because we're great friends, because everyone was there to witness the speech yesterday. We're probably not the greatest friends at the moment, but we're both too small. We don't have scale. Our companies don't have scale if they don't have the respective other market, and neither of our markets can compete with the Chinese market on their own. And understanding that, particularly in the EV space, particularly on all clean technologies, is going to be vital for US companies and European companies to succeed in this environment. And I think the last thing is that we really need to focus on sort of taking the security element of this seriously, and that requires, and I'm sorry, Jonathan, to disagree, but the market won't solve any of this. It will require a political decision about the kind of threat environment in the world that we're facing. If we think that we can trust China a little bit, or just enough for a little bit of our infrastructure, it will drive investment decisions in a different way than if we decide, no, actually not. And therefore, there will be a preference for European players, for Japanese players, for US players in our markets, and that will then generate and drive the market. I do think we need a clarity in our political risk assessment at some point to not further confuse the markets.
Can I just pick up on the point about the market solving, because I completely get what you're saying, and just sort of stress or clarify what I was saying is, we are market economies, and the way in which some of these sort of questions just run, particularly around technology, run through almost everything that is happening in the economy. And you're right, there are some times when governments will resort to saying no, and of course that is what happened in relation to 5G. We can't do that. Can't do that everywhere. If you see what I mean. So it is about that. Non-state, government business actors will be making judgments for themselves, and I think there is something about how government helps with the right information and the right guidance and all of these things to ensure that businesses are able to make well-informed decisions about their own risk. And of course, it's for governments to provide the advice and the decisions on what are related to sovereign risk where they're acting. So just sort of, you're right, but I just wanted to sort of explain a bit what I meant.
So to pick up on what you were also saying about the need for greater action, and also if you think about the road ahead in 2025 and the need for speed, for lack of a better characterization, as you started out with, and to pick up on your comments, and then Benedetta, I'd like to end with you. We're running out of time. Then what are your priorities in 2025? Understanding the gulfs that exist and divergence in some instances, but ways to discuss this as mutually beneficial, of strategic interest to allies. How can you build those bridges with your agenda, Jonathan, in the year ahead? And then Benedetta, over to you.
Well, I think it's the three things I sort of touched on, which is our own domestic and sovereign toolkit. It's how we work with our partners on developing that, and then it's how we work with the private sector on how the government and they work together on that. And the specific issue we're talking about is one of them, but it's not the only one. We could have had a whole range of discussion on specific things. So I think it is also about what's the underlying framework that we have that then we apply to what these different things are. And I think I just finished by saying, that will continue in one sense to be an art of judgment, but it has to be very well informed by science, and that's the policy making that's the policy-making challenge we've got.
And as the head of policy planning in NATO, how are you thinking about this and next steps as it relates to connected vehicles and this issue in particular?
Well, I will just second everything that has been said in terms of the importance of continuing to foster cooperation in a transatlantic framework in this context of growing strategic competition. So Janka's point, I completely agree, unsurprisingly. I also agree with the issue of urgency. I frame it just a little bit different in the sense that, yes, urgency, speed is absolutely important. Just as important is recognizing what type of security and strategic environment we live in, which is unfortunately not one of peace. It's one of contestation, it's one of competition, it's one of open war in our continent, and that requires a security mindset. It requires us to look at economic choices with a security lens in mind. Of course, protecting our free markets, our free trade, but also protecting our freedom. And I think both are at stake at the moment. And so we need to be very serious about how we think about economic and security trade-off. We come from, for many of us, come from decades of post-Cold War peace dividend, where we had that luxury, where we were trying to compartmentalize economic policies and national security. It did not work. We see now that some of those interconnection have been used as vulnerabilities and be weaponized. So I think we just need to rise up to the occasion of our security environment, and that's whether it's on connected vehicles, critical ports, or civilian satellite, or 5G.
And if I can make one little comment on sort of what to watch out for, it took BYD about 14 days to integrate DeepSeek into their electric vehicle systems. So the developments are happening at such a fast pace that it just will require all the cybersecurity experts out there to talk a lot to their governments.
Thank you for that. It really underscores the point incredibly poignantly and stresses the urgency. And those cybersecurity experts are in this room, they're down the street, and there are so many opportunities to collaborate. Thank you for sharing your expertise with us, Janka Ortel, Benedetta Brindy, and Jonathan Black. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, please welcome Minister Jan Lipovsky, the Czech Minister of Foreign Affairs, Amy Hogan-Burney, Vice President and Deputy General Counsel in Corporate, External, and Legal Affairs, Customer Security and Trust for Microsoft, Ambassador Ivo Dalder, CEO of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and Dr. Agnes Kalamar, Secretary General of Amnesty International, along with FP Analytics' Dr. Maisha Alam, for a conversation on combating cyber mercenaries.
How are you? I think we'll good.
Okay.
They are meant for two people.
Right, they are.
Hi, everybody, and thank you again for joining us. We are now very honored to have an extremely illustrious panel to talk a little bit more about cyber threats, and in particular, to consider the role that cyber mercenaries who develop, provide, or support offensive or intrusive cyber capabilities for a fee, often in the private sector, so to speak, but linked to state actors, how they pose threats to the global security environment and what can be done about that. So I'm excited to dive right in, and I'd love to start with you, Foreign Minister. The Czech Republic has been really forward-leaning in terms of digitizing public infrastructure and supporting a growing digital sector, which is great. But of course, that comes with a multitude of cybersecurity risks, including opportunities for cyber mercenaries to strike. And you yourself were the target of a cyber attack from hackers hired by China. So tell us a little bit about your perspective on this issue, and how has the Czech Republic confronted the risk that cyber mercenaries pose in the face of an increasingly complex and evolving threat landscape?
So first of all, thank you very much for doing this splendid event, and thank you very much for the invitation. And Also, thank you very much for saying that the Czech Republic is forward-leaning with digitalization. This is something we need to say more during the upcoming election campaign, which is closing in Czechia. But on a serious note, the complex issue needs a complex solution. And in the case of Czechia, it's complex architecture beginning with the National Cyber Ethics Law, which gives the power and enables our National Cybernetics Authority and gives certain powers and coordination role in a state system that can that as a result the system can act when something really happens, and it's not only about words. So in this regard, I would like to mention few activities which are very important. First of all, we have a very active diplomatic cybernetic diplomacy. It means that not only the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also the National Cybernetic Authority has a connections to key players. We have cybernetic diplomats in the USA, in Israel, in Australia. We have a good connection to the major players. And therefore, Czechia joined multiple attribution campaigns. It's important when something happens to be able to support each other. You cannot do it without understanding and without the technical analysis which is necessary for such an event to have. So we have this infrastructure, and we are part of this game, to say so. I think the last example which I would like to mention that we supported this attribution was the Russian entity Z servers and individuals connected to that targeting US and UK, but we also joined when the German attributed. It was actually the joint attribution between Czechia and Germany and supported by NATO and the EU attack on our institutions, I think through some hole in Outlook. And this also creates this push for ACT. In a sense that the institutions will update its systems and all these things together, but also it creates it's opening doors for possibility, for example, to sanction the actors. And we know hackers for hire. We know for sure that the state actor, the easiest way is to pay someone to do the dirty job. So the attribution to be able to find who is responsible for that, it's very important. And of course, that's what I wanted to mention in my first answer. Thank you.
Thank you for that. And there's so much I'd like to pick up on that you talked about. Certainly the attribution piece, which you came back to over and over again. It's about technical attribution, but it's also about political attribution. And this is something that we at FP Analytics have been working on for a number of years now, with support from Microsoft as part of a multi-year special report called Digital Front Lines. And if you were here at the beginning of the program, you heard that we are launching what is part 5, the latest installment of that report today. And it's called Hackers for Hire, Confronting the Growing Market for Cyber Mercenaries. So if you're here in the room, there's a QR code that you can use. And if you're online, it's a digital report. And we're very fortunate to have a number of contributors, including among them Amy Hogan-Gurney of Microsoft. So Amy, I'd love to turn to you next. And let's talk a little bit about what this looks like in practice, right? Can you tell the audience what are the key platforms and networks that facilitate the kind of cyber mercenary operations that we've been discussing? And how are cryptocurrency and the dark web fueling that industry? What are you all seeing from your vantage point at Microsoft and the incredible threat tracing that you do?
Yeah, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Before I answer your question, I do want to say thank you for your attribution. It is incredibly important, and I really value the Czech Republic, what they've done in that space, because Microsoft works very hard to provide technical information, as you said, to support attribution. But from political purposes, we are a private sector company, and so we rely on others to take that leap, and the Czech Republic has just done a wonderful job, and so I just want to say thank you for that. And now we'll talk a little bit about private sector offensive actors or cyber mercenaries and the way that we see them. I think the first way that we saw them was in consumer services. And so you saw the private sector actors using consumer services for surveillance-related purposes. And that's reflected in the case against NSO Group, which we were very pleased to be able to join, but was brought by WhatsApp. And that's another example of a private company taking action in this important space. But we don't only see this in consumer services, and it isn't only about surveillance anymore. I think now, as we've started to look more deeply into this problem, we're starting to see a real marketplace for vulnerabilities. And that marketplace for vulnerabilities can be exploited on a broad scale. So you would hope that at this point that we would all be using a vulnerability equities disclosure program, and that vulnerabilities would be disclosed as appropriate to the software developer so they can be patched and fixed as soon as possible. And in fact, Microsoft, like many other companies, pays you for that service. And so we are incentivizing the reporting of these vulnerabilities. Unfortunately, there is a dark web marketplace where these vulnerabilities are also paid for by cyber criminals and others. And as you mentioned, cryptocurrency is one way to facilitate those. And so we wanted to take time to really build on the work that's already been done by others in the consumer marketplace regarding surveillance, and really highlight the idea that there is more here that can be done, and the importance of making sure that we're all working together to identify these vulnerabilities, that they're properly disclosed, properly patched, so we can try to do everything we can to cut off this marketplace. We've started to do a significant amount of research into where these marketplaces exist, and we're thinking now about what it is possible to do to disrupt it in the future. So I look forward to kind of future planning in this space.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for that. And I think it really highlights just how many different issues, from finance to security to technology and et cetera, are really interconnected in terms of this threat landscape. The other thing that you talked about at the top of your answer, Amy, was about consumers. And there's another word we can use for that, which is people. And I think one of the things that is often lost when it comes to this issue area is a real understanding and recognition of the human toll and the impact that these types of operations, commercial spyware, and the work of cyber mercenaries can have on people. And as part of FP Analytics' Digital Frontlines report, we were very fortunate to have a Rwandan American and Belgian human rights activist, Karine Kanimba, contribute an essay and talk a little bit about what it was like as a human rights activist to be on the receiving end of that kind of targeting and the effects that it has. And so with that in mind, Agnes, I'd love to bring you into the conversation. Tell us a little bit about, how does the proliferation of cyber mercenaries impact human rights globally? What are the human impacts that you all are tracking and working on at Amnesty International, and in particular in Amnesty Tech? And how are you mobilizing to support those who are targeted by cyber mercenaries? Can you share some examples?
Yes, thank you very much. I think we've already heard from NSO and Pegasus bombshell, which was well reported around the world, and which demonstrated the reach of these cyber spyware into human rights work, into investigative journalism. More than 180 journalists have been targeted by Pegasus. More than 20 countries, in fact, have been targeted. We're talking about journalists, defenders, but also head of state. Just to give you maybe one example, in El Salvador, where we worked very specifically, dozens of journalists have been targeted, including 22 from one publication, El Faro, and they've all have been forced, in fact, to re-establish themselves outside El Salvador. You would have thought that after the Pegasus bombshell, we would have seen more awareness and understanding that that the sector needed to be regulated. Now, I think I really want to insist on the fact that those companies exist and there is a market because there are states that let them develop, sell, and grow. And that so far, the attempt to regulate what you call cyber mercenaries, which are basically corporate actors, has failed and has failed to protect people. After Pegasus, I just want to mention the Predator files, which is another kind of cyberware out of Europe, out of a very murky alliance or network of European companies called Intellexa. You mentioned the notification and the threat issues. So in May 2024, I think but Apple sent a threat notification to users of iPhone in 92 countries, and the example keep growing. I would like to insist on the fact that the threat is from within. You're talking about security, you're looking at Russia, you're looking at China. I'm very sorry, but from my standpoint, that is where we are right now. We are targeted by our own people, by our own government, and until we have a universal approach to the threat, we will not be able to tackle it. It cannot just be about Russia and China. It has to be about Israel. It has to be about Europe. It has to be about the United States. And if we don't have this perspective, there is no security. Your idea of security is not my security. Thank you.
Thank you, Agnes. And I think one of the things that you stressed, and I think is really important, is the insidious nature of this technology and the fact that it has an extremely chilling effect on people who are targeted, on their families, their communities, and it has this ripple effect that keeps going. And you stressed the importance of regulation, which of course is one critical piece, and another is the role of diplomacy and the fact that these risks are cross-border and they're international. And so, Ambassador Dalder, I'd like to bring you into the conversation at this point and ask you, from your vantage point, and you were the former U.S. ambassador to NATO, amongst many other distinguished roles, what is the role of international diplomacy when it comes to cyberspace and the growing market for cyber mercenaries and the range of risks that we've been talking about here today, including against people, against critical infrastructure?
Well, one role is just to follow up on what Agnes says. If you have an international framework that should govern behavior with regard to the use or non-use of cyber capabilities, just like we have a variety of legal frameworks to govern how to fight wars, what kind of weapons can be used in what kind of circumstances, you can create, and in fact we are actively engaging in creating an international regulatory framework about what is acceptable and not acceptable behavior. And more can be done through diplomacy to do that. And there are active ongoing efforts to effectuate these kinds of agreements. And we're working in this unique space with the private sector in many ways, Microsoft being a leading example of helping to both frame what those rules are, how they might be most effectively enforced and observed. But let's be clear, just as we have rules about how to conduct a war, doesn't mean that everyone abides by those rules. And part of the challenge in international behavior, whether it is warfare or cyber engagement or what have you, is how do you deter, how do you prevent actors from engaging in behavior that is destructive? And we have had a long-standing debate in the last 10 or 15 years, trying to distinguish how you deter cyber from missile, from human rights kinds of behavior, and try to have specific roles and rules that apply to each of these different areas. I've come to the conclusion that that's a fool's errand. That the only way in which you can enforce, not build rules, they have to be specific to the situation, but the only way you can deter, prevent action, is to treat them the same. And to regard a cyber attack, if you can attribute it. One of the difficulties is the missile's pretty easy to find out where it's coming from. Though even then, particularly in internal conflicts, it can be tough. I mean, how long did it take for the international community to conclude that the civilian airliner, a Malaysian airliner over Ukraine, was taken down by a Russian operated air defense system as opposed to a Ukrainian rebel force? Took years, in fact, to get that attribution. So attribution is an issue no matter what you have, but assuming attribution is a big assumption, I know on the cyber side, holding the people responsible for the action is very, very important. And I know that the foreign minister is having these discussions on a daily basis within NATO. We are seeing all kinds of new kinds of warfare, from cutting cables, data links, and everything else, which are as destructive as if you were bombing a railway bridge, and therefore the actions that we should take in order to respond to, or better still, deter, should be similar. And why is it that we think that if you suffer a cyber attack, whether it's through a hacker that is hired by the state or by the state itself, that you have to respond in a cyber way? There are other ways in which you can respond. And this is a new debate that I think is starting to emerge, in part because here in Europe, in particular, we are being attacked on a daily basis. It just isn't being attacked by bullets or missiles. We're being attacked by anchors on the Baltic Sea, or by cyber activity that of which we're witnessing every day.
Well, and I think that point and you know, what can be done about it, and that multi-domain threat environment is something where, Foreign Minister, you have a great deal of experience, and you've engaged extensively in your diplomatic efforts and with private sector and others in terms of trying to figure out what are the mechanisms and what are the pathways for addressing these threats, to respond effectively and to prevent and deter. And there are some emerging initiatives, the Pall Mall process being one, others. So tell us a little bit about, you know, where do you see potential and promise, and where do you see the persistent challenges when it comes to establishing international norms, regulations with respect to these threats and risks?
I'm not so sure about international norms these days. So those discussions are quite difficult in the respective multilateral organizations. But yes, you mentioned the Pall Mall process, where we also part of the consultations. I like the sentence that consumers are also people. And it leads me to the another piece of the complex structure, which was just recently created in the EU. Maybe speaking here with the Microsoft, it's not so happy, but this is the Digital Service Act. And Digital Service Act gives Commission a role to be in touch with platforms, TikTok, X, Instagram, Meta, whatever, and to discuss, let's say, the consumer protection. And the consumer protection may include by the artificial intelligence creating content to sway you to give someone your credit card details. It might be content which violates law. I'm speaking about terrorist content and speaking on different other contents like child pornography. And also we have rules connected to elections. So to have this process where national state communicates with Commission, in the case of Czechia, it's Czech Telecommunication Authority, and and in many other countries you have those authorities, and this all gets together, and then we can commonly have a profound discussion with platforms how to protect consumers. And I think it's important because we see that a lot of the discussion on resilience, because you spoke about the cables, it's not hybrid warfare, this is an act of sabotage and sponsor state terrorism if it endangers people's lives and make economical damages, and we should address that. And I think we spent quite a lot of time discussion how to fight terrorism and defend ourselves, NATO. So we just need to call a spade a spade. There's a lot of discussions about yesterday's speeches at the Munich Security Conference. It created a lot of emotions. But if we use what we already have, because the DSA was passed and now is being implemented, at the end of the day, we might find ourselves in a much better position as a Europe, as a continent, as the EU. Of course, I'm not a big fan of protection and regulation. I think we should be clever about that. I think we should be clever the way how we do it with artificial intelligence. But we have real ways how to build up our resilience. So I wanted to use this example. And I would like to mention that actually we have quite good communication with Microsoft, with its MTA, Microsoft Threat Analysis Center, which provided even Czech State with quite useful insight in things through different campaigns. And I would like to just encourage for such kind of open communication. So it doesn't have to be some malware or virus trying to hack your computer and then steal your data or ransom you, but it might be also this kind of cooperation.
Yeah, thank you for that. And Minister, you were talking about Microsoft's Threat Analysis Center, and we've done some work with them. And Amy, I'd love to come back to you for a minute. The platforms where these types of risks emerge from and operate, many are run by the private sector. And as we've heard over and over again, there's really no way to take on this challenge without that kind of public-private coordination and information sharing and coordinated action. And so tell me, what responsibility do tech companies have when it comes to mitigating the threats that are posed by cyber mercenaries? And how are you going about that, considering that many of your clients are states, right, nation states? So how do you balance that? And also, what would collaboration within the industry look like? Because no one company and no one private sector actor can do this alone. Not even one of the largest in the world.
Yeah. So. I'll start with your last question first, because I just think it's the one that not enough people ask. And so I appreciate it very much, which is, what can the private sector do to collaborate amongst itself? And the answer from my perspective is that in the area of cybersecurity and in making sure that we have the proper resilience around the world in order to make sure that we ensure trust in our systems, there should be no competition. This is the space where this is not a place to use competitive advantage. This is a place to share information in order to harden our systems. This is that all boats rise together. And we have long believed that. We have partnered and joined briefs with WhatsApp. We have brought cases together as plaintiffs with AWS. There are countless ways that we seek out the other private sector companies in order to really live that mantra. And so I think that it actually requires a proactive approach from the tech companies themselves, a willingness to lean forward, and frankly, to set aside competition in this space. You asked a little bit about the threat tracking and our responsibility here. On a daily basis, we are currently attacked over 600 million times a day. I believe that AWS came out with a report that said they are being attacked in their cloud infrastructure about 700 million times a day. That volume of attack is astronomical. And so you can do everything you can to block all of those attacks. And if you're 99.9% perfect, you still haven't done everything that you can, which means it requires you to work together as the private sector to get better, but it also requires support from the public sector to share that information. We're currently tracking approximately 900 different threat actors. 600 of those are nation states. Those nation state actors are using all tools available, including the vulnerabilities that I mentioned at the beginning when we were talking about private sector offensive actors and the dark market for vulnerabilities. It should not be that we are trying to protect against the nation state actors that will stop at nothing using vulnerabilities that we should be able to patch. So yes, we do have a role to play, but I think we all do together.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And we're almost out of time, but I just want to put one last question forward to all of you. And I'd love to start, Agnes, with you and then work down the line and give the minister the last word, which is, over the course of this discussion, we've talked about attribution, we've talked about deterrence, we've talked about accountability, we've talked about the role of, the private sector, of civil society organizations, states. There's so much to cover. But if I would like to ask you, if you could issue one discrete call to action that you think is most urgent and most timely, considering the proliferation of the cyber mercenaries market, what would it be? And so I'll start with you, Agnes, Amy, Ivo, and then the minister.
There cannot just be one call, I'm sorry. So, first of all, we need to insist on the fact that the spyware industry cannot be made an exception to, for instance, demands of due diligence placed on corporate actors, which is what happened at the EU level. There is a good due diligence directive, but it has excluded the spyware industry to check what will be the end users' impact of what they are selling. So the ambivalence of of all states, including European, Americans, and so on, is what needs to be tackled. The policy ambivalence and the political ambivalence. I think we need to insist on the fact that human rights cannot be made the hostage or the victims of this competitive search that we were hearing about, or indeed of the vision of security that is extremely nation-driven and do not include individuals. As long as the human rights of people who are on the receiving ends of a great deal of those cyber attacks are not placed at the heart of our policy making, we're gonna, well, first of all, you won't have our support. You won't have the support of civil society. We cannot just be made the tool or the pawn of a strategic security vision that violates our rights and violates the rights of the most vulnerable people. And you need civil society with you if you want to fight back against a range of other actors. And finally, let me add one more point that you have not been discussed. Right now, one of the greatest cybersecurity threat is coming from failed state, where a great deal of criminal gangs are operating. One of them is Myanmar, which is amounting to a failed state. I just want to put that on the table because our failure to tackle international security issues, our failure to have the Security Council act in a resolute manner, our failure to deal with a military junta, all of that is impacting as well on what you are seeking to address today.
Thank you. And I think that example about the Thai-Myanmar border and that thriving is a really, really important one. So thank you for that. Okay, Amy, very quickly, and then Ivo.
Very quickly, I just want to thank cybersecurity researchers and the very hard job and work that they do to help protect our ecosystem. And I want to encourage them to continue to report all of their vulnerabilities, and we will continue to be very public about the vulnerabilities that we have received, because without full transparency in that ecosystem, we will not be able to continue to tackle this problem.
Thank you.
So I would just plead for one thing, that, and this is primarily for state actors, but if a state actor attacks another state, it's an attack, whether he throws a stone, shoots a bullet, or sends a bunch of bits down a computer line. And we should think about it in the same way, and we should respond in the same way.
And finally, Minister, the last word is yours.
I think, to be very brief, we need to protect our financial system and the regulation connected to that, so that we keep the current level of transparency in financial transaction, and that directly leads to cryptocurrencies and everything connected to that, since this is the main enabler of being for hire in that hackers for hire question we are discussing today. And also I think it's important to add that the state actors would not be able to hire; they would have to create their own structure, which is much more costly. So yeah, I think this is something which needs to be dealt with somehow, and to.
Thank you. Well, that piece on financing is one that certainly my team and I at FP Analytics are thinking about and looking forward to working on in the future as part of our Digital Frontlines partnership with Microsoft, because, it's as they say, follow the money. And when it's for hire, you really have to get to that. So thank you, Foreign Minister. Thank you, Ambassador Amy and Agnes. Thank you so much for being here and for your perspectives.
Thank you.
Next, please welcome Dr. Tom Inglesby, the Director of the Center for Health Security at Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Jamie Yosef, Vice President of Global Biological Policy and Programs at the Nuclear Threat Initiative, and Dr. Andrew Hebler, Director of Biosecurity at the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, for a conversation on strengthening biosecurity in the age of emerging tech.
Let's keep going. As we mentioned earlier, we're covering quite a set of topics, and I can hardly think of one more important than biosecurity, and I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to have this discussion with not just a set of really individual experts who are at the top of their fields, but together, so we feel very privileged. I know there was a fair bit of background noise when you all were coming up, so I'm just going to very quickly say who everyone is in case you missed that. So at the end, we have Dr. Andrew Hebler, who's Director of Biosecurity at CEPI. We have Dr. Tom Inglesby, who's the Director of the Center for Health Security at Johns Hopkins University and former senior U.S. government official. And then in the middle, we have Dr. Jamie Yosef, who's Vice President for Global Biological Policy and Programs at the Nuclear Threat Initiative. So thank you all for being here. Let's dive right in. And Jamie, I'm going to start with you. Let's set the scene a little bit. What are, in your view, the most pressing biosecurity risks today, and how do you see them evolving? What do people need to know and understand?
Thanks. Sure, that's a really important question, and thank you so much for focusing on this as part of your discussions today about emerging threats. So I'll start by saying that we are experiencing a 21st century revolution in bioscience and biotechnology, and has incredible potential benefits to society for advancing human health, including vaccine development and other medical countermeasures for helping to combat the effects of climate change or advancing economic development. It holds tremendous promise. But at the same time, a lot of these advances are dual use, and it poses risks of accidental or deliberate misuse that could have really catastrophic consequences, and we need to be mindful of that as well. We did see the effects of COVID, which were really devastating in terms of the public health impact, the economic impact, the political impact. And we need to understand that this is not necessarily a once-in-a-century event. It could happen again. Next time, it could be from a naturally occurring event. But I also worry a lot about human-caused events, either an accidental or deliberate misuse of the tools of modern bioscience and biotechnology. These ongoing advances are really lowering the barriers to access and making it possible for a wider range of people to engineer living systems and to make pathogens that are more transmissible among human populations, more deadly, and or resistant to the vaccines and therapeutics that we have in place. And this could be accidentally or deliberately misused by malicious actors. And artificial intelligence now converging with the life sciences is really accelerating those changes. Again, lowering the barriers to entry, but also raising the ceiling on what's possible. So we are also really focused on AI bio risks, and that's one of the reasons that we on Thursday convened a tabletop exercise to explore some of these AI bio risks with policy leaders here at Munich and to explore some of the solutions to reduce those risks.
Thank you for that, Jamie. And there's so much to unpack in everything you said, from vaccines and countermeasures to the role of diplomacy and the need for regulation, and not least how AI is changing things for the better and for the worse. So I'm looking forward to touching on a few of those issues. But Tom, I'm going to go to you next. And, Jamie just gave us a lay of the land in terms of the range of risks. And from your vantage point as a subject matter expert, but also as a former government official, how should policymakers prioritize biosecurity threats to ensure that those risks that Jamie's just laid out are actually being met, in the moment? And what is it that you think that policymakers today are really missing when it comes to the nature of threats at hand?
I mean, great questions, and it was. I certainly agree with what Jamie just said. I think there are a number of very clear and present biological risks. For example, H5N1. We're seeing a change in pattern causing disease in animals and new patterns of disease in humans.
And this is the bird flu one.
Bird flu H5N1. Yeah. There are other viral families which are capable of spurring a new emerging infectious disease. We, for example, had an exercise in 2019 on a coronavirus pandemic because we are focusing almost exclusively on influenza pandemics, and we shouldn't be doing that. So we should be thinking broadly about pandemic risks, natural risks, accidental risks, deliberate risks. And policymakers, unfortunately, I think too many of them, I don't want to overgeneralize, but too many of them right now, for too many of them, pandemics have dropped off the priority list altogether. People don't want to, at least in many parliaments and congresses, people don't want to talk about pandemics. They don't really want to talk about public health. They've moved on to other things. People are exhausted by pandemics. But pandemics could return without any warning, just as COVID arrived without any warning. And so we can't let our defenses down. The other thing about getting ready for biological risks is that it is a tractable problem. We can make things to protect ourselves. We can get better prepared in all parts of the world. This is a common threat to all of us. This is the only class of technology that has been banned as a weapon around the world. So all of us have a shared interest in being better prepared and sharing what we learn. So I think policymakers, unfortunately, are not attending to this problem. It doesn't mean the technical community isn't attending to it, and these issues will rise and fall, and we'll continue to make the case, but I'm a little worried about the dial down in attention to these matters.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I want to come back to you about the BWC in a second. You didn't mention it, but I know that's one of the things you were alluding to. But first, I want to go back to something that Jamie was talking about earlier. And it's, of course, relevant to what you were talking about, too, which is the role of vaccines. And I know that this is something that you are very passionate about and very focused on at CEPI, rightfully. There's a great deal of lessons learned from the COVID pandemic, but as Tom was saying, that's hardly the end all, right? So we need to be forward looking. Why is the rapid development of safe vaccines vital for addressing engineered biosecurity threats? Help draw that connection for people and why it matters and what it looks like in practice.
Great. Well, thanks, Maisha, and thanks to Foreign Policy for hosting this great panel discussion, and importantly, focused on biosecurity. Part of why we, CEPI, a vaccine research funding organization, are here at the Munich Security Conference is to underscore the important point that biosecurity and pandemic preparedness is, in fact, global security. And dedicating this kind of attention is, and shining a spotlight on these important issues is really, really important. As you mentioned, you asked the question about why are vaccines important. We have seen that we are in the midst of an era of increasing epidemic and pandemic risk. That's the reality of the world we live in. And we need the tools and capability, we have within our reach the tools and capabilities to take epidemics and pandemics off the table as a threat to humanity. We've recognized that as we've worked over the last 2 decades to fight emerging infectious disease threats. And importantly, in the context of COVID, I think what we learned is that having the capabilities to develop safe and effective vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics is critical. And it was really through COVID vaccine development, COVID therapeutics development, that inspired a really bold vision that it's within our reach to have the capacity to develop safe and effective vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics in 100 days. And this is collectively known as the 100 Days Mission. Importantly, it was elevated under the UK G7 presidency, embraced by the G20, and it is now a global agenda that's inspiring the world. And importantly, for my organization, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness Innovations, it is organizing principle for what we're trying to achieve. This complements some of the traditional approaches to vaccine development, which are very focused on sort of priority pathogens, and recognizes the reality that many of the things that will emerge in the future are probably things that we don't know or wouldn't predict. And so what we need is the capabilities to respond quickly to neutralize those threats that emerge. But the reality is, maybe the last point I'll make here, is that while the 100 Days Mission agenda has been embraced by the global health community in combating natural outbreaks that emerge, there is less recognition by the global security community of the important role that having the capacity to develop vaccines, therapeutics, and diagnostics quickly, i.e. in 100 days, is also helpful in neutralizing deliberate threats as well. So pathogens that are engineered to cause harm. And so again, I think if there are 2 reasons why an organization like CEPI is here in Munich, it's to underscore that biosecurity and pandemic preparedness is global security, and that the 100 Days Mission agenda is not just a health agenda, it's a security agenda too. And so that's why we're working to define exactly how this can support security priorities.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I think, listening to you speak, I'm reminded of a conversation that was happening on the main stage yesterday. And this was on AI, and Senator Mark Warner, a U.S. senator from Virginia, was saying that in his view, the risks and overlooked risks with respect to the deployment of AI in the field of biosecurity are greater than any other domain. But we also know that there's a real important role in terms of the preventative measures and the resilience as well. And so I'd love to talk about that a little bit. And if you were here for the previous segment, I was in conversation with the Czech foreign minister, and we were talking about cyber resilience, and especially as attacks are increasingly on infrastructure, including health infrastructure. So with all of that in mind, Jamie, I'd love to ask you a little bit about the role of AI from your vantage point at NTI. I know it's something you said you've done even this week, some tabletop exercises on. How can AI and synthetic biology, in your view, enhance biosecurity measures? And at the same time, what are the greatest risks that people need to understand with respect to, as Andrew was talking about, engineered threats or otherwise? Bring these 2 kind of issue areas together for us a little bit.
Sure, thank you. So it's a really important issue. we've been seeing for a number of years that there's increasing convergence between artificial intelligence and the life sciences. I think there's been a lot more attention on that in the last couple of years. We've been working on that at NTI. I'll answer your second question first about the risk, and then I'll pivot back to some of the opportunities. So I think, as I mentioned before, just to pick up on that thread, it both lowers the floor to access, so it enables more and more actors to gain access to the kind of tacit knowledge that is useful to engineer pathogens and other biological systems, to make pathogens that are perhaps more dangerous than what you might find in nature. And just gain access to pathogen engineering capabilities in general. And likewise, it raises the ceiling. So there are limits on sort of what we know as humans about how biological systems function and how we can tinker with them. And we believe that actually there are kinds of AI bio tools, they're called biodesign tools, that might make it possible to sort of envision new kinds of pathogens that maybe we couldn't think of without the help of artificial intelligence. And that has implications both for non-state actor risks and potentially for state actor risks as well. I think in terms of some of the solutions, perhaps we can get to that later on in the session. In terms of opportunities, I think artificial intelligence, as it converges with the life sciences, also can help with biosecurity. So if you think about, so first of all, very useful for rapidly developed novel vaccines. We know that CEPI is really exploring that, and it's like a very promising area. But likewise for some of the biosecurity elements. So for example, there's something called DNA synthesis screening, which leading companies that provide DNA have been doing for years. And the idea is, if you're a basic researcher in a lab, you can go on the internet and order a piece of DNA. You plug in your sort of sequence A, T, G, and C. And if you're somewhere in the West, you get a little test tube within a day or 2 or 3, and it's got the DNA in it, and then you can proceed to do your experiment. We want to make sure that DNA providers aren't selling the building blocks of dangerous pathogens to folks who shouldn't have access. Artificial intelligence can help circumvent some of the screening processes to sort of prevent bad actors from gaining access to dangerous DNA, but also artificial intelligence can engage in arms race and make those tools more robust.
Yeah, fascinating. And Tom, I'd love to bring you in on this question as well.
Great. Well, just last week in Paris around the AI Summit, we had a meeting focused on this very question that you're asking, which is the balance that Jamie was describing between how we reap the benefits of AI in the life sciences and then protect against the greatest risks. And the benefits potentially are enormous, not just within biosecurity, but within medicine, breakthroughs, cures, understanding the sources of disease. So we need to do what we can to not get in the way of that. On the other hand, our analysis, which is, I think, very similar to Jamie's and probably to Andrew's, is that there are great potential risks that are going to arise in this convergence between AI and life sciences. And in our view, the greatest risks are the potential that AI systems could catalyze, accelerate, enable new pandemic risks, whether it's resuscitation of old viruses that created pandemics or the creation of new ones as we combine human intelligence with the intelligence we're gaining through systems about virology or other pathogens. So I think that's in all of our interests. Hopefully there's something that the AI community can agree to, which is we do not want these systems to create great harm to humanity. I think if we try to protect against every single maloccurrence that could come from the life sciences, we'll probably be dialing that governance on too strongly, and we will block the benefits. But at least to begin with, our view is that we should really focus on the greatest risks, whether that's through large language models or through the highly capable biomodels, biosystems that are coming online, as Jamie began to talk about.
That's really interesting. And Andrew, I want to come to you next. And I know it's something that we've done some thinking around together, CEPI and FP. And in fact, last year at Munich Security Conference in exactly this room, we put together a really dynamic crisis simulation on exactly this when it comes to AI and biosecurity. So give us your 2 cents on this.
Yeah, well, Andrew agrees. We don't want AI to destroy civilization as we know it. So we can put that as a first principle. But, the reality is artificial intelligence technologies, as you've already heard, are going to transform society across sectors. And health is the same. And we feel, again, as a vaccine research funding organization that's aimed at neutralizing epidemic and pandemic threats, that we have a responsibility to lean in and essentially unleashing the power of AI to accelerate global progress toward capabilities that will allow us to develop safe and effective vaccines in 100 days. Those applications are across a range of different capabilities areas, from the detection of emergent pathogens in early warning, to the design of novel vaccines to neutralize those emergent threats, to applying AI for preclinical testing of vaccine and countermeasure candidates, to clinical research and testing, to biomanufacturing. AI is going to have applications across that whole spectrum. We've been focusing a lot of effort over the last year and a half or so at leaning into investments that will allow AI to basically save a lot of time in designing safe and effective vaccine candidates. But we also recognize that the systems that we will need to design or identify potential candidates can be exploited, can be misused. And we feel we have a critical responsibility to ensure that the research we're funding doesn't inadvertently cause the thing we're trying to prevent in the first place. And so that's why, in parallel to our efforts to lean into AI investments, we also have been a leading force, along with the Center for Health Security, NTI, in a broad consortium of scientific AI developers and biosecurity experts to figure out both what are the risks of misuse we see as the most important, and what are effective approaches we can apply to mitigate those risks in ways that will strike the balance between unleashing the benefits while guarding against the risks. But I think importantly in this area, we talk about risk of misuse, but we also need to be talking about risk of misuse. And what I mean by that is if we are preventing AI applications in certain areas because of responsibility or to prevent misuse, we also are curtailing the ability of AI to support some of our pandemic preparedness and health goals. And that can mean that there are a lot of suffering and deaths that are happening because we are preventing AI from being used. So the missed opportunity of AI. And so again, as we try to calibrate that balance between benefits and risks, we need to be thinking both about misuse and misuse.
Thank you, and it's a perfect segue to where I wanted to take the conversation next with respect to misuse and the mechanisms that already exist and those that need to be developed. And Tom, you were talking about this a little bit earlier in our conversation, the kind of undulations, if you will, of attention. And so tell us a little bit about, what mechanisms do exist to prevent deliberate misuse of biology and synthetic biology. And at this moment in time, and with the advent of AI and everything else that's going on, what do you see as the combination of international norms, standards, regulations that are needed and that need to be built upon to really be able to do that kind of striking the balance that Andrew was alluding to?
Yeah, well, there are a range of interventions at the global level and at the national level, and then in the private sector. Everything from international norms. The Biological Weapons Convention bans an entire class of weapons. It's the only convention to do that. That's a treaty. Below that, we have guidance that comes from international organizations. So the WHO, World Health Organization, has guidance about laboratory misuse. It's coming out later this year with advice to public health professionals about how to respond to deliberate events or deliberate misuse. And then we have down at the national level, we have guidances, occasionally laws, occasionally regulations. I think if you look around the world right now, for the most part, the law that we have, or that countries have, might be something around making sure that pathogens are locked up in the right way, something many countries call select agents, which in my view is a law that was basically about 15 years old. It hasn't been adopted to any of the challenges that we're talking about. In a few countries, we have some guidance, some rules around how to manage or govern particularly high consequence biology or biotechnology. But in most places, that doesn't yet exist. and it certainly doesn't exist for AI and life sciences. So we have a long way to go. I think the Paris summit last week was a missed opportunity, really, in safety and security broadly, but particularly in life sciences. Unlike the first two summits, where there was a lot of discussion around global norming, around safety and security, that was basically pushed into a small corner of this summit. So I think the technical community has a lot of work to do to try and push these issues forward and then resurface them to the political community. But I think in terms of waxing and waning right now, in terms of AI and life sciences, I think political leaders are ready to gun it, and the safety community is going to have to make the case for wise governance.
You know, in listening to you speak, one of the things that strikes me, especially as you were talking about the various mechanisms that already exist, is that there are a lot of different mechanisms out there and that have been, there for some time. And of course, it's really important to adapt to the changing realities of emerging technology. But we shouldn't, ignore what's already existed. It's a matter of strengthening. Jamie, let me bring you in on this.
Sure, and I think Tom has done has really laid the sort of table about what the existing mechanisms are, and I think we all agree that we want to strengthen them. But I think we also don't, governments and international regimes are really struggling to keep pace with the rapid advances in bioscience and biotechnology and now artificial intelligence. And we also need to think creatively about how we can be agile and think about how we can bring technology solutions and practical solutions to meaningfully reduce the risk now and try to get them built into these regimes and have these regimes promulgate them. And I think specifically for artificial intelligence and AI bio capabilities, I think we have an opportunity to thread the needle here and find ways to guard against accidental or deliberate misuse of these powerful capabilities while still enabling innovation to go forward and capturing the benefits. And I think that there are these guardrails that we can put in place. We can look at DNA synthesis screening as the model. This is something that industry stepped forward and developed more than a decade ago, screening DNA synthesis orders to make sure you're not selling dangerous DNA to folks who have no business having it. And how can we apply those similar kind of guardrails to the context of AI bio tools? And so there's an opportunity to develop those technical solutions, but really it should be part of a three-legged stool. We need the technical and practical solutions to reduce risks upstream. We need global platforms so we can share best practices among countries at the national level and also among expert communities and also with the private sector, because this is a global problem that requires a global solution. And that's where we can really build it into some of these regimes. And then we need governments to step up and private funders to step up and incentivize compliance with these best practices so we can drive compliance widely. For example, in some of the AI bio work, we are pursuing at NTI some pilot projects to develop some of these new to explore the possibility of different kinds of guardrails. We also have created this AI Bio Global Forum as a place for the community to come together and share ideas and best practices of what tools may or may not work, because we saw that there was a really fragmented conversation that was only being led in a couple of countries and a couple of companies, and we really wanted to have a global discussion. We're hopeful that governments will find the political will to take this more seriously and put some incentives and regulations in place, but I think it's going to take an effort by the community to push for that.
Yeah, thank you for that. And there's one piece in particular I want to probe a little bit more on. And you were talking about a minute ago, where you've seen important and promising activity in a couple of countries, but that the global discussion, the global forum is not as active. And that's one of the things that you're working on. And Andrew, I'd like to turn to you next and ask you a little bit about, let's take a global view of this, right? What are the barriers that you all seen are focused on when it comes to enabling low and middle income countries to be able to access cutting edge biosecurity tools, but also to be a part of the governance discussions and shaping the decision making for all of the types of calls to action that each of you have been talking about?
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And I think, what we have seen, well, obviously, CEPI is a vaccine research funding organization, but we have a global constituency. And we've seen from our partners a real eagerness to contribute to the effort, to be a part of the effort, and particularly to be a part of the discussions about how to weigh balances and risks. And so that's why efforts like Jamie's talking about, efforts we've been involved with at CEPI, to really widen the aperture, to bring as many to the table in this nascent stage of technology development and also sort of risk mitigation to figure out how we can strike that balance. But I think one of the key missing pieces is we didn't have, as a community, a set of principles to sort of guide the responsible development of AI applications in protein design in particular. And I think what's been remarkable about the emergence of artificial intelligence in recent years, and I'm saying this as someone who's been involved in several biotech emergence events over the last 2 decades, is that usually to devise an appropriate solution, you need active collaboration between the scientific and the security communities. And in the past, it was always the science community was from Mars and the security communities from Venus, and you would put them together and they would be kicking and screaming and they'd find a solution, but there wasn't the kind of collaboration and integration at the outset of technology emergence that we're seeing with AI. And that is what is different to me, and that's also what gives me hope. But it was out of that broad coalition of scientific and security experts that emerged a set of principles to guide responsible development. It's now available at responsiblebiodesign.ai online. This is not just an effort that was developed in a narrow set of channels. It was actually a broad global effort. It's now been signed by and supported by more than 200 global scientific authorities from I forget how many countries, let's say 25 or 30. But there's an eagerness for a broad global dialogue on this issue. And so what we are trying to do at CEPI is use our resources, our networks, and our convening power to help integrate a broad range of global perspectives, but in particular perspectives from the global south. Because how we strike this balance is going to be critically important, but we can't actually figure out how to strike it until we have effective ways to mitigate the risk. And so that's what we're working to develop now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And Tom, let me turn to you next.
Yeah, I was just going to add a short comment on the importance, not only for low middle income countries that are part of these conversations, it's not only important to think about benefit sharing, which is crucial and which did not happen very well during COVID, which we could talk about, but don't have time. But it's also important for them to be at the table and have a voice around governance. There was a great session this morning in this space about emerging leaders from the global south, and they're kind of rising into positions of responsibility. And even while it may be the case that low middle income countries may or may not be the ones driving these cutting edge, possibly dangerous technologies, the consequences of those technologies, if things go wrong, will disproportionately hurt low and middle income countries. And so when you ask people who think about this in LMICs, they want to be part of the governance discussions, because it's not fair that people in only a few places are leading edge on a particular technology, and if it goes wrong, it spills across the world. And finally, I think LMICs really depend on the guidance that comes from international organizations. So if we want, in many countries, they may or may not have something like a CDC, so they depend on the WHO. So we have to support the WHO. We, the collective we, unfortunately, events in the United States, very disappointed in that. Hopefully that's reversed, but in general, I think we really need to support that, because that is guidance that affects the world.
Thank you for that. Well, I mean, we've covered so many different things, and at the same time, I feel like we could stay here all day and talk about these issues, but unfortunately, we're out of time. So let me just take this opportunity to thank you all for joining in this conversation and the work that you're doing, Dr. Hebler, Dr. Vyasov, and Dr. Inglesby, and thank you to all of you for listening and tuning in online. If you are in the room, we have some seats up front, so please feel free to come up here if you'd like and claim those seats.
Thanks,
but thank you so much.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Please welcome Ili Bayraktari, President and CEO of the Special Competitive Studies Project, for a debrief with Foreign Policy's Ravi Agrawal on the recent Tehran Security Conference simulation.
Hi, everyone. You all, okay, if anyone wants to sit in front, please do, as Marsha just said. It is a great honor for me to have with me here Ili Bajraktari. We had a really fun simulation just a couple of days ago, and I realized none of you were actually in the room. So what I'm going to do, and also no one on our live stream was in the room, we can't talk about who was in the room, which is sad because there are a lot of really, really cool people in the room.
Sure.
But what we can do is tell you a little bit about the premise.
Right.
So this was a simulation in which we had a fantastic group of people, Chatham House rule. It was called the Tehran Security Conference. Tell us more.
Yeah. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you to Foreign Policy for being a great partner for the exercise we had 2 days ago. Just a little bit of background. So last year, we hosted another event at the end of the Munich Security Conference. And you know, generally in these gatherings, there's a lot of doom and gloom about the state of the world, you know, the state of the democratic world. And so I remember one of the dinner participants who comes from the intelligence world, he said, I would be really curious to know if this conference were held in Tehran,
right,
what would the axis of evils, disruptors, whatever you want to call them, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, what they would be talking about.
Yeah.
So that came as an inspiration to us last year. And so we partnered with the Foreign Policy magazine this year, and we developed a tabletop exercise in which the participants played as participants or attendees at the Tehran Security Conference, and we challenged them with a scenario that I can talk about it because it's a really
And so
cool
the participants, again, not naming names, but it's a mix of former foreign secretaries, home secretaries, ambassadors, spy
intelligence officers,
exactly.
All sorts of high-level intelligence, high-level decision makers, national security professionals. So the scenario was as there was a major breakthrough in one of the large language models. The year is 2026, so it's a year from now. And so all these 4 countries are gathering in Tehran to talk about the implications of, you know, whether it's one company or many companies making these major breakthroughs in AI, and what are the implications for these 4 countries.
Right.
So the participants, which sometimes was hard for participants, as you noted, to play the role of other countries or other government representatives.
Yeah.
So we played that scenario for about 2 hours, and it was fun. It was a lot of insightful conversation. Obviously, these are challenges that we're dealing with every day because we just saw the release of DeepSeek and the implications it had on the market, on you know, the application, and obviously the downloads, and how it appeared to become #1 app downloaded in every app store.
So as you have all of these top, mostly Western policymakers, spy chiefs, are now putting on a hat of thinking and feeling like they are Iran or Russia or China or North Korea. Did anything surprise you about how they gamed out how this quartet would respond?
Right. First of all, as you remember, Ravi, for some of them it was really hard to put a hat on.
I don't know. I mean, there were some people who were like,
enjoyed it. Some of them really enjoyed that role. I thought it was a lot of fun. Surprises, I think, on some end were, you know, the positions maybe collectively they would take as a you know, like axis of disruptors, or individually representing their national interests. And where do they stay? Where do they stand probably in that technology stack? You know, you have some really advanced countries like China, and whether or not it's in their interest really to partner with Russia, North Korea, and Iran for anything like that.
Sure.
And on the other hand is, you know, you have countries like North Korea, and sort of like their interest actually in staying ahead in technologies by partnering with the other 3 countries.
Yeah.
So that was like the delicate balance of how they played collectively, but also individually as representatives of these 4 countries.
Now, the simulation began with an LLM sort of AI kind of prompt, but then it rapidly developed into also including trade and export controls. And one of the things that surprised me a little bit was how other countries, so not just the quartet, but how they tried to involve an India or an Indonesia.
Right.
Talk about that a bit.
Yeah. I'll talk about that, but another important point that I think you guys did extremely well is at the end of each of the moves, we also then ran the scenario through a large language model.
That's right.
Yeah, and then we looked at the results produced by a large language model using the same prompt we use for our tabletop exercise. Which was
And the amazing thing there was GPT-4 believes that the so-called axis has a lot more unity than we do.
Right. That was, I think, one of the difference between the humans and the machines.
Yeah.
That I think the machine believed that there's a much more unitary approach to the of these 4 countries towards technology competition, whereas whereas I think our participants disagreed,
right.
Believing that each of them have their national interests,
right.
their national goals, and sometimes they were not in the same line with the other countries there.
Right. By the way, if GPT-4 is correct, America's in deep trouble on that front at least. But yeah, talk to me about how so-called swing states got involved.
Yeah. So we had 2 moves, Ravi, in the game. The first one was like, this happens, and they gather. And then we had another move a year later.
A move is when the scenario develops further.
Exactly. And you present the participants with, the first scenario, and then you ask for their feedback, and then we run it through the ChatGPT, and then we had another move, which was, gathering a year later, which was 2027.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point, I think the most surprising thing there was that in that second year, how these 4 countries started maybe reaching out to other participants in the international arena, people that were like either in the middle, countries that were either in the middle, countries that were maybe impacted by our policies, through export controls, AI diffusion rule, all these countries that probably are falling into different categories of this new tiering. And so it was just interesting to observe that shift towards can they get other countries to join their bloc?
Yeah.
And what is it in it for them, and also for these countries to get together and start sharing this technology.
Yeah. Does anyone in the audience know, have any of you played a war game before or been a part of a formal war game?
War game sounds really but like a tabletop exercise.
Yeah.
It's much softer.
There you go, a softer language.
Yeah.
But this is basically the opposite of that. So it's where you're basically looking for better outcomes instead of war. But
red teaming exercise too. You're trying to think with
exactly
like your red head.
But part of the thing that I think is really cool about these exercises is because you're not yourself. You're trying to imagine how someone else would deal with a scenario. In imagining their perspective, there's a level of creativity that then ends up informing role playing. But you emerge with something new. Like you've learned something about how the adversary, or whatever you want to call it, would act. Right. What did you learn?
I mean, I think there were a lot of interesting things that would come up. Like whether or not the Axis's goal is really to win the technology competition, or stay really second, near the top, but not make a cutting-edge advances, because it's much comfortable probably. You don't need to make incredible investments to stay at the cutting edge. But if you're near the top, that gives you enough space not to be further down, but also still enjoy the benefits of these technologies without investing enormous resources to stay at the cutting edge. So for me, that was an interesting strategy. If you look at the DeepSeek, probably that is reflective of their strategy as well. Low cost, much less compute power than any other Western model probably. But the technological leap they've made was incredible, right?
Yeah.
And so that was an interesting observation, because if you're cut off from the world in terms of getting the compute power, the chips, and all these things, if you're cut off from the world in terms of the data centers and all these things required to build these new models, then what is the alternative approach you take to stay ahead, right? So I think that was an interesting observation yesterday.
Fascinating, isn't it? We just have a little bit of time left, but very quickly, part of what we were thinking about in this exercise is how quickly AGI is going to develop. Do you think that if you ask GPT, for example, to think through, is there a bias within the system to think that it is going to evolve faster than it will?
It's a good question. I mean, look, the one thing that I think we can observe is since the release of ChatGPT, there have been probably more than 30 models that have been released, and this is like 2 years ago, right? And so you can see the pace and speed of how these things are advancing. Now, if you listen to all the major CEOs, they're all talking about AGI being within a reach, whether it's 3 years, 5 years, 7 years, right? But I remember when I started doing AI, we were talking about AGI 2045.
Right.
So now the conversation has become this decade, right? And so the models will give you a different interpretation of what AGI really is. Is it the combination of the agentic AI or multiple agentic AI that all of a sudden surpass human intelligence and they can pass all the, scores in these tests? But I think if you look at it, this decade really becomes the most important decade for that purpose, because probably for the first time in human history, we will have an intelligence that is at a higher level than human intelligence. And I think that will have huge implications for the economy, the employment, obviously for national security, and how countries position for the future.
Well, hopefully you and I will be talking about this for a few more years instead of the AI version.
Or we don't participate in the AI's TTX.
Exactly.
Well, thanks so much, Ravi.
Real pleasure.
Thank you.
Eli Bajrakari.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Please welcome the Honorable Omilcare Harun Mohammed, Member of Parliament of the Kenyan National Assembly, and Ndidi Okonkwo-Nuneili, President and CEO of the One Campaign, for a conversation about the security and economic implications of foreign aid.
Hi, okay, I'm still here. So we have a great opportunity here to talk about why aid matters, what is happening to the aid infrastructure globally, which is very much in the news. And then lastly, I want to move us towards what the aid community and the world can do to make up for that loss that we're seeing filter through the system already. I have two wonderful guests. Ndidi, let me start with you. And I think it's worth just talking through a little bit, why does aid matter?
Well, thanks for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. I think aid matters because we have vulnerability across our world. There are conflicts linked to climate change, economic crisis, ethnic disputes, power struggles, and those gaps have to be filled. Now, it's really critical for health, for economic stability, but also for the necessary world humanity and community that we all belong to. We are connected as a humanity, and that aid is a way to show that in times of need, you can step in. Germany really was rebuilt by aid after the World War. I mean, we talk about the Marshall Plan. This is an example of an economy that rose again, following support from its neighbors, following support from the world. And that's the same thing. In fact, we just launched a campaign, and if you'll indulge me, I'm going to give both of you a $103 bill.
Oh, thank you.
And we have enough for the audience. And if you turn the bill around, it says that for every dollar spent on activities that's for economic growth and political stability, we can avert spending of 103 on future conflicts. One's data just revealed that the global economy in 2023, because of conflict, spent over $190 trillion. Now, if we can avert conflict, which is where aid is so critical for economic growth, for stability, for healthy lives, then you can ensure stability, which creates peace for all of us. We've been talking in previous panels about pandemics, epidemics, conflicts. We're sitting here in the Munich Security Conference. Aid averts this if it's used appropriately, and it has a direct return on investment on our economic growth as a humanity, our stability, and our continued prosperity. And so for me, I'm a big believer that when used wisely for the right things, aid transforms our ecosystems.
I have to say, I don't think I've ever heard a better 2-minute explanation for why aid matters. And not only that, with a prop as well. I'm just going to move a little bit closer, I'm being told, for the cameras. Is that okay now? Excellent. Umi, talk to us a little bit, just from your perspective in Kenya, how you've seen aid make a difference and potentially what the loss of it would mean.
I mean, I can't help to take note that she has consistently insisted on if aid is used properly. And I think that's where the conversation should be, because it's not about how much aid do we have, but how exactly are we using the funding that is coming to different countries for different support. In Kenya, many among the fundings, including the PEPFAR, is one of the budgets that are used to support patients with HIV and AIDS. We are looking at a population of 1 million people in Kenya who are currently, at a distressful situation because most of the funding came from the USAID. And we are coming up to do our budgets sometime in June, and we have to actually sit down and structure a way that we prioritize a lot of health and healthcare budgets that, will be affected because of the funding cut that we are having. We have them.
Can I ask you if you can quantify the cut? How much is it worth?
I mean, it was close to 2 billion shillings that were coming to the PEPFAR. The global fund also used to give a donation of up to 3 billion for the mosquito and the malaria funding programs. And Kenya is actually one of the biggest beneficiaries. We are looking at, I think in Africa alone, over 2.3 million children who will be affected by the funding, because malaria is one of the highest leading rates among the leading rates in child death and mortality issues. So, of course, it's a challenge, but I think as a Kenyan politician, I'm looking at it as a chance for Kenyans, and not just Kenyans, but African countries to actually start looking into reorganizing their budgets, because we've come from far. We've had conflict in some areas, but in the Eastern African region and the East Africa region where I come from, we've enjoyed some sort of improvement and stability, and we've really benefited from a lot of aid programs. But now is a chance for us to actually restructure so that then you don't have to entirely rely on aid, because what happens when the funding freezes, like what we are actually facing currently. So, of course, it's a challenge, but I look at it as a chance to reevaluate, because a lot of money ends up being misappropriated when you have the confidence that, there's some donor money that will come in that can take care of HIV, can take care of malaria, can take care of food. In 2018, WFP withdrew officially from the school feeding program in Kenya. That didn't mean that children went hungry. It just meant that the government of Kenya sat down to prioritize school feeding and were able to inject up to 6 billion shillings. So those are the situations that we are looking at.
Sure.
Could this be a chance for us to improve?
Right. Yeah. Indeed, now that with USAID's cuts, we were listening to the Kenyan side of the story, but at a macro level for Africa, what is the impact going to look like?
So I'd first say that the way that it's been done has been very abrupt and disruptive.
Yeah.
And that has created massive uncertainty, some form of panic, not just in Africa, but in DC, where I happen to live.
Yeah.
And quite a bit of waste already.
Yeah.
In fact, $90 billion worth of HIV medication is being held up somewhere, and it will expire if it's not distributed. So we are convinced that we need to be on a pathway to sustainability. And that pathway has to be well-structured, systematic, well thought out, and involve partners across the board. When I first took on this job, that was a very clear question Lindsey Graham asked me: when will PEPFAR end? PEPFAR has been one of the most successful interventions by the Republican Party under Bush.
Yep.
Saved 26 million lives. There's an ROI on PEPFAR. So yes, there has to be an end. When PEPFAR was started, it cost $10,000 to treat someone who had HIV. Today it's $40. And the truth is that in many African countries, the African portion of that cost is up to 70 or 80%. So there's no country that is completely dependent on PEPFAR funds. There's a pathway. Now, that pathway is what we believe at the One Campaign. We have to work in partnership with Africans and our G7 countries to ensure that we do it in a smooth way that doesn't disrupt too many lives. So my first message is, it is critical we do not disrupt what has been started. The soft power that we're discussing today is so important at this critical time in geopolitical unrest in our world. And we need to ensure that we sustain trust. You don't break trust by abruptly stopping something. You gradually persuade. But to my sister's point, I just came from Addis this morning. I was in Addis for the African Union meetings. And yesterday, I was in a room with 8 African presidents and ministers of finance, leaders from Gavi and Global Fund and others. And it was so heartwarming to hear African presidents say, we have a wake-up call, we are taking full responsibility for our citizens, and we're going to be partnering across the continent to make sure that we invest in local manufacturing for vaccines, for drugs, building out infrastructure, reducing waste, and ensuring transparency and accountability. So I actually left Addis encouraged that there's leadership on the ground that recognizes this is an opportune time to do things differently in collaboration with each other and in collaboration with partners that are key to this transformation.
So that sounds great for the future, because aid is never a long-term strategy, it's a shorter-term strategy. And if you can transition out to a better local model, nothing like it, but there is a short-term disruption. Umi, let me bring you back in here. How do you think, given what you just heard about African countries getting together to invest their own money, how quickly do you think something like that could fill the gap left by USAID, for example?
I think it won't be something that will happen immediately, because that means there are countries that have already done their fiscal budgets for the year, meaning they cannot just have some money lying extra to come and support. So that will be a challenge. And if you look at the numbers, we will be having increased rates of HIV/AIDS among especially young adolescent girls, women and girls who are benefiting from the PEPFAR program. We would be having, numerous problems. But in the long term, like you said, aid is not sustainable. But in the short term, it would mean that the challenges will still be there. And it's about what exactly can we have as a plan B, because USAID is not the only funding that has been, coming up to support these programs. We have the European funding that is available, but still there'll be shortfalls, especially in Kenya. The currency, I'm a bit worried, because a lot of the programs were funded by the USAID. They're actually, regions, cities within the city that have come up because of the USAID programs, especially around the embassy areas. So that leaves you with the question of how can this affect the Kenya shilling, for example, or how will this also affect the Kenya shillings and currencies for other regions within Africa. So I think it might be a challenge. It's something that was not expected, but that just is a wake-up call, because how many times can we suffer from impulse decisions that will be made by countries like, the US, especially with the current president? You can never know where you stand.
Yeah. Indeed, it strikes me that, you began this discussion by giving us this $103 note, and it's memorable. I'm going to remember this. But it also reminds me of how a lot of us have been thinking of President Trump in the United States as quote-unquote transactional. And I'm guessing there's a reason why you were presenting this note as a transaction, basically, that aid is a transaction, but it's a transaction that pays off. Now, in a transactional world that we now seem to be entering, are there other countries that are going to take on this very example that you just showed us? Is a China or an India or an African country going to take up the mantle of investing that gap that the US has now created?
Well, I think it's a unique time in our history. We have seen China play a long game by investing in infrastructure on the African continent over the last 20 years. We've seen trade with China increase exponentially. But we also have seen growing interest from the Middle East, growing interest from other players in Asia, and many African countries actually stepping up. My challenge at this time, and I think I agree with my sister, Madam Mohammed, is the importance of mutually beneficial relationships built on transparency, accountability, and respect. And I think there's a new bargain, a new paradigm shift that we need when we engage with the African continent. It's no longer what does the world think Africa needs, but what Africans are demanding at this time from the world. And I think there's a unique opportunity for Europe. It's no chance that, not by chance that we're sitting here in Germany. Germany has played an important role historically in terms of engaging with Africa and committing to Gavi, the Global Fund, IDA. Those are very important partnerships, and Germany has been a leader. And we believe that even with the leadership transition that will happen next week, that we're calling on Germany to play that role. We're calling on France to play that role. We're calling on the EU leadership to play that role. And today, sitting with some EU leaders, we talked about the cost of capital and the fact that when you're investing in Africa, yes, aid is one piece that grants funding, but there's a place for concessional financing, for catalytic capital, for pension fund money, for de-risking instruments, because you can have mutually beneficial growth.
And to be clear, this isn't just charity, this is
an
investment.
It's an investment. And so that's what we are calling for Europe. And European investment banks and the European Development Funds and the DFI sitting in Europe have an important role to play to fill that gap. And we've seen KFWs of the world and AFDs and BII from the UK stepping in and making strategic investments that are mutually beneficial. And we want to see more catalytic capital to drive growth. Because when economies grow, then they can address it. But two other issues. The cost of capital is an issue. There's a risk premium that is placed on investing in Africa, and it's unacceptable. Oftentimes, Africans are paying 500% more for catalytic capital for debt. And through the G20 and South Africa hosting it, the One Campaign is pushing for a review of this risk premium that Africa pays. The second is the debt burden, which is really linked to the risk premium. We've paid for very expensive debt, and it's crippling our economies. And countries are paying more in debt repayments. There's more money leaving Africa that's coming in. So these are critical to this discussion as we transition in this pathway to sustainability. And we are convinced you can't look at one issue without looking at the rest of the spectrum of issues that will drive growth.
And of course, unsaid in this is Europe and America's history in Africa,
yes,
which is very much part of that puzzle, because it wouldn't be this way without
exactly.
Umi, let me bring you back in. As we think about the positive case for investing in Africa, when you come to a place like this, the Munich Security Conference, and you have world leaders listening to you, what do you say? What is the case for long-term investment? And in as much as there are challenges of historic debt, but also debt financing, again, how do you convince them?
I think I agree with what my colleague has said. Aid is not a charity, rather an investment. We are looking at a population of 1.5 billion people, especially with Africa being one of the leading holders of the minerals, I think around 40 to 50% of the world's mineral. So you can't look at such a continent from the perspective of aid or just charity, but exactly how do we come in as partnership, not just in terms of finances, but even in the human resource. And the global immigration is a crisis, not just within Africa, but largely over the world. So this is a chance, I think, for me as Africa to not just sit down, but re-strategize, see exactly how we're able to partner with other global leaders. And today is a significant day because we were just having the African Union elections. Sadly, Kenya, we lost the seat because we were fronting one of our opposition candidates. But we believe that even with the Djibouti candidate, we'll be able to actually prioritize agendas that are of interest to Africa. Exactly how can we leverage from the resources that we have as we look at the global agendas and the things that are happening the world over. How exactly can Africa be looked at as a partner and not just as a country as a region that is benefiting from just aid, because at some point when you come to the table, you need to be able to show what resources you have, and that is non-negotiable for us. So sitting in this Munich conference, of course, the conversations mostly centered on Europe, but Africa still has a role to play, and as a young leader, I think this is a chance for us to move forward and be able to give priorities to things that are of need. And even as we discuss the issues of soft power and the foreign aid and the charity and the freeze, I think this is a chance that we are able to prioritize what's important, because most of the time localization hasn't been actualized. You get funding that is coming to Africa through institutions, but 50% remains within the institutions without reaching the grassroots. So could this be a chance that we're also able to pick up conversations on localization? How can we bring in young people to be able to lead conversations, for example, on peace? How could we be able to allow innovations to take the center stage so that we're able to have local problems and local solutions to local problems? Thank you.
And of course, demographics. As much of the Western world gets older, it is places like Africa that have the dynamism of youth, that have the numbers on their side, and essentially the future on their side. But indeed, in our final minute or so, much of this conversation, again, has been transactional, in part because we seem to have given up on soft power. Is that the right strategy, by the way?
I'm still a big believer in the power of humanity to act together for critical issues. We've seen the world rally around Ukraine at a critical time in its history, right? We need to ensure that we don't have a double standard with other world regions. We need to ensure that we realize that equity and justice are what connects us as humanity, and that none of us are equal until all of us are equal. I'm still a big believer in that. That's why I'm here at the Munich Security Conference. And I believe that the connection between security and soft power and sustainability are unequivocal. We need each other, and we need to work together for a future that we all deserve. And it's not just about our generation, it's for future generations, because they will hold us accountable for the decisions we take today.
I couldn't agree with you more. Soft power is the only longer-term game in town. I'll also say soft power is a term that was coined in Foreign Policy magazine.
I love it.
Many, many years ago. Ndidi, Umi, thank you so much for being here. Thank you for your work.
Thank you so much.
For the concluding fireside chat on geopolitics and energy security, please welcome the Honorable Christian Mikoski, Prime Minister of the Republic of North Macedonia.
Prime Minister, real pleasure. I'm Will. Please. Okay, Prime Minister Michalski, it's a real pleasure to have you here. Let's begin with this. This past weekend, we've all been talking about Ukraine, about NATO, and obviously the American side, the impetus is clear. They want every NATO member to up their defense spending. North Macedonia, of course, is among the smaller and newer countries within NATO. How are you thinking about the future of NATO and what this past weekend means for it?
First of all, thank you for the invitation. I'm thrilled to be a part of this event. Yes, today is the second day, and practically the messages that we are receiving are not surprised for me, because the same voices we are listening from Washington, from Trump's administration for a while. So I would say that I'm not surprised. As a matter of fact, I consider those messages as a new wind, and probably new wind of changes that will occur in the world for the coming months or years. When we are talking about NATO, and when we are talking about events that are connected with NATO, please do not forget that my country, to become a member of NATO, changed name.
Correct.
So when we are talking about give-ups, when we are talking about double standards, we should not forget about that. So our commitment for NATO was, without doubt, pretty loudly and with a lot of suffers and humiliations, conveyed to the NATO member countries. So my country commitments for being a devoted NATO member was and will remain steady.
Now, you were at President Trump's inauguration, I believe, and you just said the winds of change are coming, everyone feels it all over the world. What do you make of the early weeks of his presidency?
Again, I will repeat that I'm not surprised, because everything what is ongoing now in DC practically was pretty loudly and frankly and clearly conveyed during the campaign, directly or through the associates from President Trump and his associates. So I'm not surprised about the latest developments, and I was expecting that. And
but I have to say, when Vice President J.D. Vance spoke here yesterday, most European leaders I spoke to were gobsmacked. They said, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe what I'm hearing." You weren't surprised.
If we are talking about double standards, then also we should raise Macedonian issue. You know, we are for almost 2 decades candidate country to become a member of EU, but unfortunately we are not able to become a member of EU because of some artificial constraints imposed by, unfortunately, some of the member countries in EU. I heard those voices here in Munich about interference into the domestic issues, but when we changed our flag, when we changed our currency, and when we changed our constitutional name, what was that? Isn't it interference into the domestic issues?
Interesting.
And why such a loud voice was missing then? Even now, we are faced with additional hurdle to change our constitution again. If we want to start negotiations with you, what is it? Isn't it interference into the domestic issues? Why all those guys are such a silent?
Those guys as in Brussels, or?
Yeah, in Brussels, elsewhere in Europe. Why those gentlemen and ladies are silent when it comes to the Macedonian issue? Because being a politician with double standards is not good. It's not good example and it's not good message. So when we have a burden on our back, it's pretty heavy. But when someone else has a burden on his neck or on his back, then it's okay. It's not on my back. Let's be frank and let's be open. If we want to have a decent world, then we have to keep to our values. Otherwise, if we lose our values for once, then we will forget about our values for all.
It sounds to me like you're agreeing with what Vice President Vance said yesterday.
I just want to convert this message to my issue.
Yeah.
The issue which is connected with my country.
That makes sense.
We started our campaign to become a member of EU with one name. In that time, that was also a humiliating name. It's supposed to be temporary name, former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. In the meantime, someone exerted pressure on us and we changed our constitutional name into the Republic of North Macedonia. And no one knows what will occur in the future. But you know, this is a small country at the heart of the Balkans, and no one cares. No one give a damn about that.
We care. That's why you're here.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for being here. Look, I know we also wanted to talk about energy security, and I realize your country's a net importer. You're a landlocked country. It's very important to protect your energy integrity and supplies. How are you going about thinking about that?
Yes, we are a landlocked country, which is a bit of disadvantage. But however, our new government, which was elected a couple of months ago, as a matter of fact, this is our 8th month of our mandate, we would like to convert this disadvantage into the advantage. Why? Because two very important pan-European corridors are naturally intersecting on the territory of my country. I'm talking about Corridor 10 and Corridor 8. So we would like to be literally crossroads, a bit of hub for energy, transportation, railway, and highway. And this is something which is our biggest priority, and so far we are doing well. We are progressing with the railway, which is a part of Corridor 8, which is the second most important corridor for NATO, especially because the aim of Corridor 8 is connecting Black Sea with the Adriatic Sea, connecting port of Varna with port of Durs in Albania. And also we are accelerating modernization of Corridor 10 railway, because we would like to increase transportation of raw material products that are coming from the east, because now majority of those products and raw materials are traveling to two European ports, Rotterdam and Hamburg. If they harbor at port of Piraeus in Greece, and probably they will use Corridor 10 for transportation to the Central Europe, this will be a bit of leverage for all of us, and we will benefit from that transportation because we will be on the route. And this will increase the revenues, and this will increase our geostrategical importance. And that's why we need to have something in that regard, and that's why we are working very hard to finish those milestones, which will convert my country in the country which will be literally crossroads of two very important pan-European corridors.
Fascinating. Now, you mentioned the word leverage. It seems to me we're entering an era where the rules-based order, now almost 80 years old, seems to be less relevant, less salient. It seems like countries have a new or increased impunity to try and break rules. I'm thinking of Russia invading Ukraine, but I'm also thinking of the United States breaking WTO rules. And in that kind of a world where stronger countries get to do what they want and smaller countries suffer, I'm paraphrasing Thucydides here, there's no leverage for smaller countries. How are you, as the leader of a country that is much smaller than many of your neighbors, how are you positioning yourself? I mean, you're a member of NATO, obviously, but what other leverage are you able to use?
Yes, we are a member of NATO after all those humiliations.
Right.
And we intend to be a part of EU because, as I said, we are a candidate country for almost 2 decades. Having this information or not, but we started our journey to the EU full membership even prior to Croatia, 25 years ago. And now Croatia is a part of EU, is a part of the Schengen, they're using euro as a national currency, while we are in the lobby. As a matter of fact, we are not even in the lobby, we are somewhere, no one knows where, and we are not able to negotiate because, as I said, of some artificial reasons, and we don't have other leverage. We don't have other option. We are a part of Europe, and we would like to apply European values. But what is ongoing lately is something which is completely different. Practically, we are witnessing on so-called Balkanization of Europe instead of Europeanization of Balkans, because some of the Balkan member countries are bringing Balkan disputes and values in Brussels instead of vice versa, instead of receiving messages and signals from Brussels and applying to the Balkans.
Do you want to name those Balkan countries?
You said that Russia is neglecting, is denying Ukrainian identity, Ukrainian language, church, invasion, which is terrible and which is, I would say, very, very wrong in the 21st century. But at the same time, when Parliament of one of the youngest EU member countries is neglecting Macedonian identity, denying my mother tongue, Macedonian language, which is official language of United Nations since 1945, and it's internationally codified since 1977. Then what we are talking about? Why everybody is silent then? Why everybody is pretending that this is not occurring? We are talking about a small country at the heart of the Balkans with less than 2 million people, which want to be a part of the European family, and they are not able to be a part of the European family because someone, as you said, a little bit bigger, got into the EU table prior my country.
You've got to name the country at this point.
Our eastern neighbor now. We are facing a lot of problems with our eastern neighbor, I mean Bulgaria, so.
Yeah. Well, Prime Minister, we are over time, I'm afraid, but it's been a real pleasure to chat with you. I wish you all the best in Munich.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah.
Okay, that's a wrap. That's been a fantastic discussion. There were so many points that I wanted to raise, but I'll just come back to what the Prime Minister mentioned, the Balkanization of Europe rather than the other way around. We talked about a lot of issues today that I thought were incredibly fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to wrap it up right now. I just wanted to mention that this is just a sample of the kind of programming that FP does around the world. We're going to be having a solution summit focused on how we solve for some of these problems in Washington, D.C. in April. That'll be followed by our Global Health Forum, which will be in Geneva around the World Health Assembly in May. NATO, and really sticking with the MSC theme in The Hague in June, July, late June. And then, of course, UNGA in New York City in September, and a lot more programming around that. I really appreciate your spending time with us today. If you're not a subscriber, please subscribe to FP and enjoy the rest of your MSc. Thank you so much.